If the Douglas Motor Company could have been just a little more successful, we might have been talking about Omaha as one of the car building capitals of America. You heard me right, Omaha. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter on the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. And boy, we have a full range of automobiles, from early Fords to Ferraris, more than a century of automotive innovation. But before we talk about the role this Douglas truck played in that evolution, make sure you like and subscribe down below. Those likes are really important. And in the comments, let me know what I got right and, of course, what I got wrong, and whether you have ever encountered a Douglas truck or a Douglas automobile. All right, let's start talking about this 1917 Douglas truck. Now, this particular truck and the one next to it were both given to the museum's founder, Mel Martin, when he was just 16 years old. They were used for hauling ore at a mine here in Arizona. Now, let's go back and talk about Douglas as a company. It got started with its roots in Omaha. A man named James Drummond was a carriage builder looking towards the future. He started the Drummond Motor Car Company in 1916 in Omaha. Drummond's firm had been building and repairing carriages for years, but by the mid-1910s, the automobile had become the future, and Drummond, he wanted in. The company's early cars came in two main versions. There was a 4-cylinder and a 6-cylinder model. They were pretty conventional for their day, with modest horsepower ratings, but, solid, dependable design. But Drummond, he had bigger ambitions. In 1917, he introduced a bold new model powered by a Herschel-Spillman V8 engine, producing 28 horsepower. It was a pretty sophisticated choice for a small regional automaker. After all, Herschel-Spillman engines were used in early fire trucks, speedboats, even airplanes. Only a few hundred Drummond cars were built, but they hinted at what might come next. By 1918, well, the company had reorganized, and it took on a new name, Douglas Motor Company. Now, to be honest, I have no idea why they changed the name. I did a bunch of research and I really found no answers. So if you know why the company switched names, please tell us in the comments below. The new factory went up at 30th and Taylor Streets in North Omaha, and for a brief time, it became one of the city's industrial landmarks. Douglas wanted to be more than a carriage maker gone modern. It wanted to be a full-fledged automobile company. Under the Douglas name, the company launched its most ambitious model yet. It was called the Douglas 8, powered by that Herschel-Spillman V8, and there are some reports that claim the engine could make as much as 75 horsepower by that point. That was pretty impressive for 1918. Douglas promoted its car as smooth, powerful, built to last, hoping to attract customers who wanted a locally made alternative to Packards and Cadillacs. Unfortunately, it was bad timing. The First World War had just ended, the post-war economy was pretty unstable, and the auto industry was consolidating fast. By 1919, Douglas had built only a handful of cars before realizing there was more money and less competition in trucks. Throughout the 1920s, Douglas shifted its focus entirely to commercial vehicles. The company built sturdy, well-regarded trucks with payload ratings ranging from half-ton to 3.5 tons. They became popular with local businesses, construction firms, even regional delivery companies throughout the Midwest. Let's walk around and take a closer look at our 1917 Douglas dump truck. We actually have two of them here at the museum, sitting side by side. Rarely will you see one, and we happen to have two here at the museum. And we're going to start by pointing out this hand crank up front. That is how you would start the engine, and you had to be pretty careful in that confined space. You want to make sure you didn't get a kickback as the engine was trying to kick over. As the legend I remember hearing was that Charles Kettering, who invented the electric starter, the automatic starter for a car, did so because he had a friend who broke an arm while trying to hand crank an engine. At least that's the legend I always heard. Very simple frame. Look at those two side-by-side long pieces of metal that go back, just a simple ladder frame. Now, I'll talk about that engine in just a moment, but I really want to talk about these tires because these are pretty unusual. These are solid rubber tires. Now, this one is degraded quite a bit. And in fact, they've all degraded quite a bit. It was Charles Goodyear who invented the concept of vulcanizing rubber back in the early 1800s, which made it possible to make the rubber stable and something people could use. But even by the late 1800s, the idea of having a solid tire had really given way to pneumatic tires, because the reality is they just gave a much, much better ride. Even the Model T was using pneumatic tires at this point in time. But for a vehicle like this, a dump truck, as I mentioned, that was carrying ore from a mine here in Arizona, concept of having big solid tires really made a lot of sense. And look at these massive artillery wheels. These are actually metal as opposed to a lot of the wooden ones that you would have seen in the day. And look at this huge rear end on this thing. Once again, you can see how it's really degraded, but you can imagine there's a good reason for that. It probably had a lot of work in its day. Let's talk about the leaf springs in the back, because rarely do we get a chance to see them quite so bold and beautiful. In this case, it's important to point out that we have two sets of leaf springs because we've got this massive hauler on the back that was probably carrying literally tons and tons of rock and ore. Leaf springs as a concept really goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Carriages were using them for a long time. The idea was pretty simple. You know, you would heat up the metal, make it stronger, and then you'd start stacking. See all the different levels. Each one is an individual piece of metal. They call them leaves, basically. Semi-elliptical, meaning that it was just partially round. They had three-quarter, they had full elliptical. But in this case, we have a semi-elliptical and another semi-elliptical on top of it. And this one, as you can see, has a big space in here. So as the vehicle was driving along, if it would hit a big bump, this was designed to stop it just a little bit more. So it's really interesting to look at how the elliptical spring evolved and how it was being used with so many different levels. If you look at a Model T, I think there was only like three leaves on there. But in this one, boy, an awful lot of it as it was going down through there. Should talk a little bit about the history of dump trucks. You know, the idea goes back to the 1800s when they were converting wagon beds into dumpsters. I think they actually started making motorized vehicles that were dump trucks like this one around 1910 or so. And then eventually they came up with the concept of having hydraulic dumps. This one I believe is manual. I think if you look over here, I think this is the lever that would release the actual bed. You can see as it goes through to right there. The spring would help it, but the idea being you would release it, this would lift up, that would allow everything that was in there to, go backwards, and you could unload it, a simple way of unloading it. Big Douglas name in the back, that way everybody knew exactly what kind of vehicle you were driving. But you look at it in terms of simplicity, and boy, they don't come much more simple than this. The driver wasn't protected in any way, shape, or form. The engine was just up front, barely covered, but the rest of the vehicle was simply there for one purpose: hauling all that ore. I'm going to guess that they didn't do an awful lot of ore hauling with this truck in the darkness, but if they did, they had these great headlights. Okay, they had lights. They weren't spectacular, but this is basically what a lot of cars were using back in those days. You'd flip it open, you had a little wick right there. Down below you had a little canister which held your oil, kerosene, whatever. This would adjust the wick. You'd light it, close that. This is where the smoke would come out so that it could have enough air to be able to do what it needed to do. And this lens, well, this would project that light forward for you. Once again, not a lot of light, but enough to at least sort of see slightly ahead of you. Well, the Douglas Motor Company was known for using 8-cylinder engines in some of its cars, the Douglas 8, for example. When it came to building this 1.5-ton truck, they decided to use a 4-cylinder engine instead, and it really made sense when you think about it. That Herschel-Spillman engine that they were using in their cars was pretty complex for its day. You got to remember, it really didn't come up with having simple V8 engines for decades after that. So if you were going to be out in the field and you were having an engine that was going to be used for industrial or agricultural purposes, you wanted something that was simple, easy to repair, easy to understand. That's exactly what you could get with a 4-cylinder engine. Now, Douglas was not building its own engines. It was buying these engines from a company called Buda. Buda was actually named after Buda, Illinois. The Buda Engine Company was building these for industrial purposes, for agricultural purposes. Back in the 1910s, they were supplying them to people and companies like Douglas that were trying to come up with a truck concept but didn't have the wherewithal to build their own engines. They were doing that. And the Buda engine was pretty strong. They were known for being, really solid engines. In fact, they were being put in Mack and Federal truck back in those days. And there was a Buda engine that even powered a tank during World War I. Buda eventually was absorbed by another company, Allis Chalmers. Allis Chalmers diesel was the Buda engine. They continued building it for years and years. So the basic concept behind this engine really went on and on and on. And going back to the point, really simple. First off, there's plenty of room to work on this. I like this lineup right here with the water pump that's feeding the water from down below up into here, the generator, 4 spark plugs on top. On the other side, we have what's called an updraft carburetor. We're used to downdraft now, where the carburetor would sit up on top of the manifold, feed the air down into the engine. Well, back then it was very common to have updraft carburetors where the air and the fuel were mixed and then flowed upwards. By the way, on the other side, there is also a Buda ID tag for this engine. So for a company like Douglas, who was trying to build trucks but really didn't have the full range to build engines, getting a 4-cylinder engine like this from Buda really just made a lot of sense. Basic on the outside, basic on the inside as well. This is the, shall we call it the interior, the cockpit, the driving area. And boy, it was about as simple as you could ask for. Wooden boards on the bottom. You're sitting on top of a tank that has all the gasoline in it. This is a later model chair. I'm sure it's a lot more comfortable than the one they were actually driving around in. Steering wheel, big and wide, because you didn't have power steering. You had to have something you could muscle around. Throttle and spark up here. Shifting gears here. This, I believe, is a handbrake. If you look up front, it's interesting because right here, we have a gauge. And that gauge, instead of saying Douglas, says Drummond on it. Remember, the Douglas Motor Company evolved from the Drummond Motor Company, so they were still apparently in 1917 using leftover parts. This also has an air cleaner that is coming up through the dashboard right here. We'll call it the dash, the floorboard almost, coming up through here. And that made a lot of sense if you were out in a dusty Arizona environment, having an air cleaner that was, well, slightly more protected. It wasn't sitting up there with the engine. But once again, very simple, very basic. I'm going to guess that this lever over here, on this side, I think that is actually what attached to the dumper in the back. It's missing a connection right now, but I'm guessing you would have to pull that back, and that's how you would release the back end so the dump section could dump back. Once again, as a driver compartment, it was pretty simple. Like I said, no protection for the driver from either the sun, the wind, the rain. But you have to remember, they had just in 1917, up until that point, they'd probably been using horses to haul their ore. So using something like this, well, this was a game changer. It actually had the power to just keep moving, and you didn't have to keep feeding it. You could carry tons and tons of ore without having 8 horses hitched to a wagon. So this was pretty revolutionary. If you were working in a mine, revolutionary to think what you could haul and carry with this dump truck compared to what the horses were doing just a few years before this. These Douglas dump trucks may have started off as workhorses, but later they had their moment in the sun. Owner Mel Martin would regularly use them in parades, load them up with friends and family, and show them off to the world. So what happened to Douglas? Well, for a time they did okay. They started experimenting, in fact, with twin axle and 6-wheel designs. It really showed that Douglas wasn't afraid to try to innovate, even on a small scale. Still, it apparently wasn't a smooth run for the company. In fact, I found one notice in the early 20s that showed they were insolvent, and then other stories that they were expanding. There were almost fistfights that broke out at least one stockholder meeting, and then harmony broke out later. As a truck builder, Douglas managed to weather the ups and downs, though, of the 1920s. But what it couldn't escape is what came next, the Great Depression. A lot of small automotive manufacturers across the country folded almost overnight. I'm not sure when Douglas officially closed, but I did find a notice from 1936 where they were selling off their manufacturing equipment. And I'll venture to say that there are not many Douglas trucks left to remind us of the days when Omaha tried to rival Detroit.